a button that begins the show.
There it is.
The show that starts like no other. Here we go.
The views and opinions expressed by the guests of Sasquatch Experience do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the hosts, sponsors, or affiliates of the Sasquatch Experience. As always, listener discretion is advised.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Does a legend walk among us, lurking in the forests of our world?
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my sensor light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard. A good-sized man or something. It looks like a man. I don't know what it was.
For over 15 years, we've talked with scientists, researchers, investigators, and witnesses, trying to gain insight and proof around the existence of this mysterious entity.
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Deal!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh. Okay, hang on.
He's right...
Is he in your yard, sir?
Yeah, God, he's big.
Okay, what's he doing in your yard?
He's looking at me.
Join us as we continue into the investigation of the Sasquatch Experience. And good evening, folks. Welcome to the Sasquatch Experience for Monday, May 8th, 2023. I'm Sean the Fort Shot Forker. He's Vance Nesbitt. That's good old JB, James Baker down there. Mad at the world, mad at a lawnmower, but ready to get things started.
$2 a month.
For as little as $2 a month, you can continue to support Sasquatch Experience, get the show ad-free, and starting this week or next week, you're going to get a new feature from James and myself. James and I reacting to the stories on Reddit, which we thought would be an interesting take for all these weirdly posted internet things. I've been reading through some of them, have some interesting opines, and I just thought, man, this is something we need to get Baker's take on. And on a Monday morning when he and I are out and about doing our drives or working on the land, what better time to discuss these strange stories than
important topics of the universe?
So we're going to be recording those and posting them up for our Patreons, something different for our supporters. What do you think about that, Vance?
I think that's amazing. Well, I think I might find the time to listen.
Well, you know, for as little as $2 a month,
unchecked and uncensored, and after
everyone.
Even better.
Very much so. Unchecked and uncensored. And as we talked about, well, actually, we didn't talk about it. We hinted at it, I think, last week, Vance, we were going to be having this very special show, our Ron Anonymous story. Vance, why don't you tell us a little bit about how this came to be so we could just get right on into it. Henry May absent tonight, folks. Sorry. Don't have him with us, but hope he's doing well. Just needs a little break, apparently.
Yeah, well, quite possibly. And he may join us in a little while. We'll see. Yeah, Ron Anonymous. Look, the show is entitled Ron Anonymous for a reason. Ron is an individual that I've known personally, and we go with Ron Anonymous for the fact that he has taken over the years an understanding of how certain groups in the Sasquatch community can kind of get a little bit belligerent with each other, and he really didn't want to be involved in that aspect, so he didn't want really anybody to come at him for any of his experience. But I find, you know, myself knowing Ron for the amount of years that I've known him, I completely understand that. So this is why the show was titled Ron Anonymous, but I'll give you a little bit of a background as to how I came about this individual, and we'll go from there with what his personal encounter is. Now, Ron originally was going to do the show with myself and possibly Sean and Baker and Henry. However, I had recently purchased a new handheld device, and so far I have found 8 of my contacts did not transfer over to my new device. I do not know Ron's personal address, and he has since retired from the business in which I've known him from. So I really didn't have a way to get in contact with him again. However, he did share with me 3 separate times his personal story that I could share with the Sasquatch experience. So I'll back up from the very beginning and at least reiterate what his story is. And then, of course, if you two have questions, and if Henry shows up and has questions, or any of our listeners have questions, please, I will answer to the best of my ability without any embellishment. The company in which I work for currently for the last 25 years, the cornerstone of the business is building high density, high impact wooden crates for very sensitive machinery, and that goes from equipment for nuclear power plants to aviation equipment to basic spraying equipment. These are sensitive pieces of material. And so our company builds high impact crates so that they can take a lot of beating without damaging the product. And I have dealt with the company that Ron works for a number of years, at least 12 years. And I got to know Ron, just as a common acquaintance, because he would receive the product in which I'm bringing him from the company that manufactures these crates. And, he's a very nice individual, and I kind of like to talk to him. And he had mentioned to me shortly after Sean Forker asked me to join the Sasquatch experience. Shortly after that, I visited Ron at his business, and he was preparing to retire, but he was going on vacation. And he says to me, "Yeah, I'm not going to be here next week. I'm going to taking a vacation to Estes Park in Colorado with my wife." I'm like, "Oh, wow, that sounds great. You're going to go Sasquatch hunting?" And he looked at me with this look of astonishment. And I will never forget the look on his face that he was giving me. And he said to me, "You believe in the Bigfoot thing?" I'm like, "Well, I mean, hey, there's enough evidence out there that if it were a criminal trial, yeah, there would be enough to convict on. There's lots of evidence out there." He's like, "You are the first person besides my wife that I've ever had a conversation with that actually believes in the Bigfoot experience." I'm like, "Oh, well, I take that flattering." I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "Because I had an experience." I'm like, "Okay, all bets are off at this point." Now, in the warehouse where he worked, there's a couple of benches, work benches and benches that you would, do your paperwork on or whatever packaging that you might do on. And I propped myself up on the bench, and he asked me, he's like, "Do you have time?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm looking at my watch." Of course, at that time, the current employer that I have has since retired, so I don't think he's going to come after me now for taking personal time off the work clock to listen to a story. But just starting the Sasquatch experience with you guys, I'm all in. If somebody has a story did I just currently run across the golden idol of stories? I want to know, because sometimes we never know who's going to be the person that actually finds the key to the answer to something, and I have no idea what he's about to share with me. So I'm all in. So I sit up on the bench and I'm like, "Yeah, I've got time." "Well, why? What's going on?" So Ron explains to me, he's like, well, I can't believe that I've actually physically come in contact with somebody that has this much interest in this subject. And he continued to explain to me the story that he shared was in 1963, he's an 8-year-old boy, and he would go to his grandparents' farm in northern central Wisconsin, and they had a 1,000-acre farm up there. And he said, ever since he was barely able to walk till the age of 12, every summer he'd go to his grandparents' farm and he'd spend the summer there. And his parents would, come and go, whatever, but, grandma and grandpa were taking care of him. And keeping in mind, in 1963, which, I'm not very far behind that, the culture was a lot different than it is today. And his grandfather had bought him a .22 long rifle. Now, for those of you, I'm sure, that are familiar with firearms, when I use the word rifle twice, .22 long rifle is actually the cartridge, and you shoot it out of a rifle. There are handguns that use a .22 long rifle cartridge out of a handgun, but for a kid, you got a .22 long rifle purchased by your grandfather. Now, my dad, in that same time frame, taught me how to use his 12-gauge shotgun. This was a thing. It's not like it is today where, oh my God, the whole gun culture is being so bastardized. Going to high school, when I went to high school, I could clearly remember off the top of my head at least 5, if not 8 pickup trucks in the high school parking lot that had gun racks on the back window of the pickup trucks with either a shotgun or a rifle, because, hey, some of the kids would go shooting after school to go rabbit hunting, duck hunting, just varmint hunting, period, in the forest lands around. That was a thing. It wasn't, oh my God, you showed up and there's going to be a mass school shooting of some sort. Yeah, the culture's changed and this isn't going to be a political thing. That was the culture at the time. And as an 8-year-old boy, to be given a .22 long rifle, it wasn't sought as something that was really unusual. That was just kind of how it was. My dad bought me a .22 long rifle. He brought my brothers and myself pellet guns. So we would, build snow forts in the backyard and, have war with each other. And if you got shot in the eye, well, that's your tough luck. We're kids. That's what kind of made us who we are today. You just kind of take the brutal hits as a kid, but, that's why we're not the snowflakes of today. So when Ron went to his grandparents' farm, mind you, it's a 1,000-acre farm, and it was a common farm. So they were growing corn, they had cattle, they had pigs and chickens. It was kind of an all-around type of farm. And yes, some of the product in which they produced was sellable on the market, and that's how they sustained the farm. And Ron stated, his grandfather also bought him a pair of the mudding boots. And I knew exactly what he was talking about because I had a pair too when I was a kid. You put these boots on as a little kid and made you look like you had ginormous feet. But it was what it was in the day. They're nothing like boots that you can buy today with the gel insert cushion and they're all comfortable and waterproof. No, these were just mucking boots, and that's what they were. And he specifically said they made his feet look huge, but so be it. And he'd have his .22 long rifle and he'd go varmint shooting on the property. And on the back side of the property, he said there's a creek, but not a creek that you and I would probably call a creek. He said it really isn't a creek, but it's not quite a river. What you call something, the definition between a creek and a river, there's kind of a gray line there. But he said it's a pretty sizable waterway that went through the backside of the property, and it would go from treed areas and forest land, along this creekway. And he stated he went to the back of the property to go shoot bunnies, go shoot birds, whatever, because he's an 8-year-old kid. You're the superhero of the day. You got a firearm. You can take down anything. You're the badass. And that's how he's going out there with this attitude. And he's getting closer to the creek along the backside of the property. And what he describes to me, 3 different times describing this story over a 2-year period of time, he's always described this exactly the same way. He said he came across a human barefoot print in the mud that was ginormous to him. And he said it with 5 toes and, had the heel, the entire structure of a human footprint, only ginormous. And that's the word that he used, was ginormous. And he was stunned as a kid. This is 1963. He's stunned as a kid. What is this? He's trying to ascertain anything that he doesn't know about, but does know about what would have caused a footprint like this near the banks of this creek. Now, he did describe the mud in which this print was in. He's like, man, he said this so many times to me. He's like, it was not a wet mud. It was a soft, formidable mud that made such the clearest footprint in the mud. And he's like, if I only knew now to know back then, he wouldn't have altered it, but he took his boot. Now, when he's telling me the story, he's like, looking back on it, that boot was probably from the toe of the boot to the heel of the boot, about 10 inches. And he stepped inside the footprint to do a size comparison because he had no idea what he's looking at. He said his boot was dwarfed by the size of this footprint. And there's the train. Woo! Right on time. He said his boot was dwarfed by the size of this imprint in the mud. And again, you're an 8-year-old kid. You know nothing about Sasquatch. Nothing. This was not in the lexicon of our culture at all in 1963. It just really was not. So he had no idea what he's looking at other than the confusion of what kind of a giant could make a footprint this big. And he stuck his boot, like I said, in the middle of the footprint. And of course, his biggest regret was that he didn't have plaster of Paris. Of course, in 1963, I was a kid too. I remember the 60s. Plaster of Paris was a big thing. It was sold at every 5 and dime store that there was. Plaster of Paris was sold everywhere because a lot of arts and crafts were done with plaster in Paris. I remember as a kid going to my mom's friend's house that had a house on Kangaroo Lake in Wisconsin. And we as kids, and I say we, it's my brothers and myself, we go out on the beach on the sand and grab the seashells and snail shells, and we'd make these cool little imprints with our hands, put the shells in there, and then pour plaster Paris in there and make artwork to hang on our wall of our bedroom. And our mom, encouraged that. That was kind of a cool thing. Plaster of Paris was a really big thing back then. This is Ron's biggest regret because he didn't know what it is he's looking at. He's completely uneducated and unfamiliar with what he's looking at. But what he said was, after that footprint, and he's completely confused, he stepped a number of steps away and saw an opposite footprint away from the other footprint. And now as an adult, he realizes the stride that this thing must have taken to make that second footprint was incredible. And the second footprint was not as clear as the first footprint. He said that mud sediment was further away from the bank. And that's his biggest regret, because he's like, that would have probably been the $100,000 footprint, because there probably was dermal ridges imprinted in there because it was that type of mud consistency. It wasn't wet. but yet it was soft enough to leave very great detail. And again, he's a kid. He doesn't know, but he sees a second footprint of the opposite footprint. And he's really kind of freaked out at this point. And he finds the third one, and it's only half a print stepping into the creek. And he said he got scared. He didn't know, are there, human-footed elephants in the area? He knew nothing of what it is he's looking at. So he continues on with the story that, excuse me, that he was upset and kind of scared as to what it is he's looking at, and made his way back to the farmhouse. And he told his grandfather what he had seen. And of course, his grandfather kind of, shrugged it off in a laugh of, okay, it's your grandkid. Are you taking something like this seriously, since this is not part of our culture? This is nothing that we've talked about, none whatsoever. And he tried to convince his grandfather, but remember, back in those days in the 60s, you didn't have your quad runners, you didn't have your four-wheel gators, your John Deere vehicles to do any kind of land management on your farm property to take a ride out there. And he's a grandfather. He's not going to go walk that back property. And Ron came to that realization as an adult. He didn't understand that as a kid, but he took it as an understanding as an adult. That's probably why his grandfather just shrugged the entire thing off to say, okay, it's a great imagination, and okay, let's have dinner, and blew the conversation off. But it changed his life. He had no idea what he was looking at, but it changed his life, and he wanted answers. And I think that's very prominent to all of us that would want answers after seeing something like that. What created it? I mean, if you saw a dinosaur print, you'd want to know what's in the area. Now, Ron did state that as a kid, and we've probably have all had experiences as a child where you've had one experience, maybe a couple of experiences that get imprinted on your brain, and those pictures just cannot be faded from your brain. You have great detail and memory. And that's the impact that Ron said he had. He says he can look in his head and still see those imprints as fresh as the day that he saw them as an 8-year-old kid. And I can relate to that. I had an experience with my parents at that age that I will never forget. That was very detail orientated. So, yeah.
At any point, did he have a visual sighting of what made the footprints?
Not at that time.
Okay.
That'll probably come on the second half of this conversation, but let's fast forward. And if I forgot any details on that particular encounter after he went back to the farmhouse where his grandparents were at, and he did explain to his grandfather what he saw, and his grandfather kind of pretty much blew it off and did not go to investigate or look into it. And Ron said his grandfather never gave him an explanation as to what it may have been. Oh, well, we've got bears out here, big cat. No, he didn't give him any kind of an explanation other than just leaving it a blank page and let your imagination fill in the gaps from that.
Sure.
So let's move up 4 years.
Well,
now he's 11 years old. What's that?
Before we move on, it's almost time for the break. So we can come back
after the break. We'll finish up.
Yep. And then we can hit some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Bob, everybody, stay tuned. We'll be right back. Got the Bigfoot Bulletin coming your way. We'll take a breather. See you in about 5 minutes, everybody. Hold on tight as soon as I find the damn file.
Smoke them if you got them.
News team, assemble!
Yes, it's another fine, high-quality edition of the Bigfoot Bullhorn, exclusively on the Sasquatch Experience. I hope you're all having a wonderful Monday, or whatever day it is that you are listening to this. I'm going to kick things off here, though, on the Bigfoot Bullhorn with something that is not Bigfoot related, because that's what I do.
So the story goes, a woman flew from Malaysia and arrived at an airport in Chennai, India's Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs said on April 30th news release. Officials opened her checked luggage and found her attempting to smuggle 22 snakes of various species and a chameleon into the country. There is a collage of photos and videos that was shared on Facebook that shows some of the packed, escaped reptiles. Oh, good Lord. One video shows several snakes slithering along the floor near a blue suitcase and a yellow and green plastic container. An officer holds one of the snakes by the tail, according to a photo, and another photo shows someone holding a balled-up snake in their hand. One of the snakes escaped and slithered along a silver luggage cart. Other photos show a container with a tangle of yellow and white striped reptiles, possibly several snakes, and a container taped shut with a light brown snake inside. Custom officials seized the snakes and the chameleon, according to the news release. Chennai, if you care, is about 1,300 miles southeast of New Delhi.
I don't like spiders and snakes, and that ain't what it takes to love me.
You're listening to the Sasquatch Experience.
I don't like spiders and snakes, and that ain't what it takes to love me. Like I wanna be loved by you.
Got knockers? I know I don't. Welcoming our new sponsor to the Sasquatch Experience, Got Knockers, a fun and innovating group with products and conversations alike. Wear proudly the Bigfoot Got Knockers apparel at Etsy. Just search Got Knockers on Etsy. Then be sure to go over to the Facebook and join the Got Knockers community with numerous popular names you've heard of and trust. Thank you to Got Knockers for this new venture. Again, visit Etsy, Got Knockers, and the Facebook community group. And welcome back. You don't sound too excited. No, I am excited. Why? Well, because Sasquatch Triangle Conference is coming up. Set in beautiful Coshocton, Ohio, the third Sasquatch Triangle Conference is excited to continue to educate and entertain in Sasquatch research. General admission is $35. This will be located at Coshocton Lake Park. The date? Well, that'll be on Sunday, May 21st from 9:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. That covers all three meals. Let's see, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Bring some foodies. Speakers at this special event will be as follows. Again, I wish I had a drum for a drum roll. Doug Waller. Hey, I know Doug. Amy Boo. Hey, I know Amy Boo also. Thomas Shea and Charlie Raymond. You can go to eventbrite.com and search Sasquatch Triangle Conference, and you can buy your tickets right there. It'll print you out a map if you choose, and there is a refund policy up to 7 days before the event. However, Eventbrite's fee is non-refundable. That's it for this edition of the Bigfoot Bullhorn News. And until next time, keep your toes in the mud.
Oh my God, who the hell cares?
Well, thanks, Vance. Bigfoot Bolton folks, go check out those great events. And we look forward to recaps from them from our listeners. And of course, our good friend Amy Brew. Who would want to miss an event Amy's speaking at?
Right.
Truth be told. Hello, good
that's
speaker,
why we got to
friend.
promote it.
And of course, we'll be seeing her at the Small Town Monsters Fest coming up at the beginning of June.
Mm-hmm.
Myself and Dan Baker and Matt Arner, our good friend Cryptic Wilderness Matt Arner, will be representing the SE at Monster Fest. I don't know if they've announced it yet, but I'm announcing it because I can. I'm Sean.
Yeah, because you can. You own SE. That's right.
I do. I do. But Vance, we were talking about Ron Anonymous's footprint find before we went to break. Bob DeChico,
Right.
one of our listeners, had a comment, epic footprint find. 1963 was pre-suburban sprawl and ATVs. Probably more common then. Today, it would be great evidence. So rare today via hoaxers and crowded woodlands to find a print like that. Absolutely. I think Bob's spot on with his assessment. As I posted in there too, Vance, 1963, pre-Patterson film. Bigfoot really not on the brain of folks at that time.
Right.
And it's a different place and a different mental perspective to put yourself in. And I'm just trying to paint that to the listeners and the watchers so they just have an idea about that.
Right.
Baker, any comment before we get into the second part of this?
Well, I think you make a valid point about the hoaxers and the guys who like to play with it. The thing is you look at it that there's so many sightings before the Patterson-Gimlin and before even the 80s that there weren't, people just making stuff up. Yeah, there were some, but it wasn't like it is today where you have 14 videos coming up in an hour. So I think that would have been a really important find. The fact that he specifically found that in the time and has an idea, and it sounds like I haven't heard the rest of the story, but 4 years later something else happened. So I mean that it's got to be that we lived when we didn't live so digital and so crowded. We may have had more sightings. We would have had more evidence. But the problem is that back then they didn't see it as evidence. They just saw a strange track and they're like, oh, okay. I'm gonna move on.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that, Bake, because that's what ties into the 4 years later thing. Is the mere fact that at that time period, and I can attest to this, the school library and the public library was really your only source of information. And like I said, as an 8-year-old kid, this definitely impacted him mentally to the fact of wanting to know what it is he's looking at. He had no clue. It's definitively a human footprint, but extremely large. So therefore, it's abnormal. And when I was a kid, the public library was this huge resource because this is pre-internet, pre-smartphone, pre any kind of information. And he had stated to me, which I experienced the same thing too, the only thing that he could find was the Tom Slick expedition of the Yeti and those footprints, which did not, even resemble close to what he saw, but he found a fascination in it when he went through the Tom Slick book. But at that time, our public libraries, at least where I grew up, did the same thing. They would continually have these events at the public library, not school, but public library, of local TV news anchors that would come and do a presentation for the kids. You would have kids story time, not drag queen story time, but story time by authors of the books that were written, and they would share with the adults and the kids. And priests. And there was also movie night. 4 years later, he's 11 years old. Well, that makes it 1967, late 1967. And he sees the Patterson-Gimlin film for the first time. And he said he was shocked. He knew exactly, and this is him saying it to me, he knew exactly what that creature was. But what he couldn't figure out was, how did that creature travel from California to central Wisconsin. That's what stumped him. He's 11 years old. He's not putting biology into any of the equation here of a multiple population. He's thinking this is one creature that traveled from California all the way to north central Wisconsin somehow. But he said when he saw that film, that changed everything, because when he looked at it, just like I did when I was a kid, I knew what I was looking at was a real creature. I can't say I have proof. I'm just giving you, and of course, we're looking at the original film that's shaky and jumpy and then not stabilized. But it was that impact that film presented to him and to myself at the same time when I first saw it on Creature Features in Chicago. Actually, I don't know if it was Creature Feature. I believe it was Sven Gulli's show. Yeah, go ahead.
Just because you brought it up, a question I have for you, Vance, looking at this recent or the recently stabilized 4K quality footage of the Patterson-Gimlin film, seeing it today in that format, does it change your perspective of the first time you've seen it back way back when? Like, does that added clarity and stabilization change the feeling of it for you?
I can't say that it's changed the feeling, because first impressions are hard to change.
Sure. Yeah,
they really are hard to change. If you eat something and you just don't like it, you're never going to eat it again. Even if you see it, you still have the same opinion. So my opinion, seeing the original unstabilized footage, I was convinced that this is a real creature. It helps to see it stabilized, because now we get a little bit more definitive definition. But I can't say that it's changed my opinion, nor has it changed Ron's opinion, because he's seen the stabilized, version of it also.
That was my next question for you. Did you ever show Ron the stabilized version?
No, he came across it himself. Being that all these events happened, he's become more and more involved in doing the research. So after he saw the PG film, he did come across years later. I do not remember the name of the book, and I don't know that he remembered the name of the book, but it was, we look at Loren Coleman. He was the original BFRO. He wrote book on, locations, times of those locations of witness sightings. Loren Coleman was on top of it, but long before Matt Moneymaker was. And he had the book, and in the book, he's looking at a map of these sightings in the book, and where Ron had his footprint encounter was less than 50 miles away from where a documented account in Loren Coleman's book was. And that was completely fascinating to him. So now we're putting pieces together that it's very possible. And of course, in later years, Ron's going back over time to look at how the forest land was developed. It was an expansive forest land along these creeks between these farm fields that go through northern Wisconsin up to the Lac de Flambeau forest reservations into the national forest. There's billions of acres of forest land that this thing could have moved through to come right up to this property where he was at, where he saw these footprints at. But to have something that Loren Coleman documented in his book pretty much solidified what it was that he saw, and gives him a little bit more peace, if you want to use that as a verb to say, hey, I'm thinking this is something that actually happened, because other people had this witness encounter and they testified that to Loren Coleman, and he documented it in his book. And that's pretty fascinating within itself. But we can go years later. When Ron originally told me, like I stated to you at the beginning of this entire story, yeah, I'm going on vacation and I'm going to Estes Park out in Colorado with his wife because he likes to frequent that area. So he proceeds to tell me on that trip, when he came back from that trip, that he was at a gas station fueling up his Jeep. And they were staying in a hotel. They weren't camping. They were staying in a hotel, but he would take the Jeep and they would, go through Estes and look at the beautiful mountains. He says, we're at a gas station and I'm putting gas in my truck. And across the way, 1,000 yards away, there's small mountain ridges right there in Estes National Park. But it's not, and I know exactly what he's talking about because I've been there too. Just like you, Sean, not every mountain ridge is going to have a hiking trail on it. These are just remote, unowned land. It's just part of the landscape. Nobody owns it. There's no national park that owns it. There's no hiking trails. And he says he's filling up his fuel tank on his Jeep, and he just so happens to notice this large black bipedal thing. He didn't say it was a Bigfoot. He just said it was a large black bipedal thing walking across this low ridge mountain line about 1,000 yards away from him. Now, he did state, ever since his encounter as an 8-year-old kid, he's going to bring whatever he has to bring with him to get this. If he ever sees it again, he wants proof. And he said he had bought a $1,500 Bushnell binoculars. And you could see bird shit in a crater of a moon with these binoculars. And I get exactly what he's saying because I've looked through those things, It was in his Jeep. He didn't even think about getting those binoculars to take a look at what he's watching walking across a ridge line at Estes. But he did point it out to his wife who was there. Do you see that? And she was confused. Now, she was a complete skeptic to this day. She's a skeptic about his Bigfoot stuff, but she loves the man. She's not doubting him, but she couldn't figure out what this thing was. And again, I'm only sharing the story as how Ron shared it with me, is that he sees this thing. He's looking at the size of the trees on the mountain ridge, and this thing was very sizable to the trees that he's watching walk across the top of this. And he's like, there's no hiking trails up there. This is just a remote area that's, it's beautiful to look at, but it's not designated for any kind of hikers. And yet here he is putting fuel in his Jeep and he sees this thing, and he said, very much looked like a conical head. How many times have we seen a witness report where, mentions a conical head? Now, 1,000 yards is not really that close, but you know what? You can still, at 1,000 yards, and I know what 1,000 yards looks like, you can still kind of make out quite a bit of detail at 1,000 yards. It sounds like a lot, but it's really not. You're talking 10 football fields away from you. You'll still be able to identify something. And he did state to me several times over and over, this thing looked huge. Okay, well, you can kind of identify how far you are from the mountain ridge, the size of the trees, and ask. And he's like, if he were to guess, because that's the best that he can do, because he did not go up there to measure, but if he were to guess, he would say at least 8 to 10 feet.
Now, Vance, he observed that from the distance with the naked eye, not with the Bushnells.
Right, correct.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify because you did say he had.
Yes, but that's kind of my point of, well, why didn't you get a picture of it? Because you don't think to go get your phone. You don't think to go get the binoculars. You don't want to take your eye off of what it is that you're witnessing at that moment. And he attested to all the Sasquatch shows that he's been listening to ever since all these things have happened to him. He gets involved into listening, but he's not directly involved in any groups because he just does not want to get scrutinized and he does not want to have the spotlight put on him. He's just interested in getting information. And he said to me how many times he's heard witness report, well, why didn't you get a picture of it? Because you don't think of it at the time. You're witnessing something. You're going to witness it with your eyes and you don't want to take your eyes off of it.
What
we
led
proved
him?
that.
What led him to looking over in the direction? Did he feel like something was watching him, or was it just total happenstance? He just happened to look over and.
You know, he didn't make mention that anything was watching him. He said he was putting fuel in the gas tank of his Jeep and he happened to notice. And I believe that was his verbatim statement, was he happened to notice to look up, and he's probably facing that mountain ridge where he's fueling his Jeep up at, and happened to notice this thing walking across the ridge line on top of the mountain.
Did he happen to get an estimate on the height or weight or whatever was looking at him, the object with the conical head?
Well, he felt that it was between 8 to 10 feet. Now, that's a 2-foot difference, but that was his gut reaction. And he did state, his wife said that's abnormally large for a person, but she left it as it's possibly a hiker. But he did state it was entirely black from head to toe, face, legs, arms, everything was black. It was all unison colored. And he's like, I don't know that somebody would have a backpack on or a hoodie or in jeans that are all the same color right down to the hands, that you'd be wearing black gloves, black coat, black hoodie, black backpack, black black shoes.
Sure.
He said the thing was entirely unison in color.
Any questions, Big?
No, I mean the story's pretty solid. I mean it seems like he has something that specifically, that some reason he's either drawn to the creature or the creature's drawn to him. But he seems to have a reasonable. It's hard to get it secondhand, because it's kind of like when Sean reads a book and then explains it to me. It's like, it's a good story, but there's little details that I have questions on that you just don't know, because
Sure.
I can't ask him, But like
Right.
in general, like these stories kind of match up with a lot of the stories you get. And I also want to shout out to Coleman, because Coleman takes a lot of flack now and then. But honestly, when you look at the research he's done, the books he's written, and the things he's done for the community, he is an authority on that. So if he's, if he was learning some of the stuff he did from watching what Coleman did, then at least he was getting a big part of good part of the information correctly.
Right. And I will say that, prior to the Estes encounter, he was doing a lot of research on his own, just personal, because it's personal to him, nobody else. And I am the first person that he's ever met face to face that has an interest in this subject. So he immediately embraced my enthusiasm and I embraced his enthusiasm. And, he's trying to come up with names as fast as he can. And that guy that does that Bigfoot show on TV. And I'm like, oh, okay, there's a lot of them. That Finding Bigfoot show and that stuff that they showed. And yeah, I get it, but I think a lot of it's bullshit because that's not what I experienced. It's great to have that outside experiencer give me at least feedback to what might be BS and what's not BS. I'm not saying everything on that show is BS, but I understand the enthusiasm of, oh, we heard this wood knock. That's definitely a Bigfoot. No, maybe it's not. It might be somebody out there just, effing with your brain and hitting a baseball bat against a tree, looking for a Bigfoot also. And you don't know that they're in the area looking for a Bigfoot. It's possible. So he's very skeptical about the evidence that he sees on these television shows, and I get it. But he had great respect for Lauren Coleman because he read all the Lauren Coleman books, whether it's Bigfoot related or anything cryptozoologically related, because he doesn't know where this footprints or the 3 footprints that he saw came from. Right. Maybe it's something else. He didn't know at the time. So he's looking into cryptozoology as a subject altogether for every type of entity that might not be discovered yet. but he leaves that possibility open. So he gives, Lauren Coleman a lot of credit, and which I do too. I mean, the first book I bought of Lauren Coleman was Cryptozoology A through Z. It gives you a chronological description of everything that has been witnessed or told about, whether it's folklore or just stories. Okay, he wrote about it, puts it in the book, and now you can use it as a dictionary. Well, what comes close to this animal? Well, let's go do, the letter J. What do we come up with under the letter J? Oh, well, Lauren Coleman went ahead and did that. So I do give a lot of kudos to Lauren for putting into that. And that's why I said earlier in that book that Ron is referring to, it was Lauren Coleman that actually started the report sightings of Bigfoot before the BFRO ever came around. And yeah, the BFRO, okay, they got a database to work with now on the internet, where Lauren Coleman didn't have that at the time. All he could do was document it into a book, publish it, and hope people would buy it. And that would be their data source. But now the BFRO can add witness sightings on a daily basis, if necessary, on an internet source, which, okay, that's great. I'm sure there's a lot of sources on there that are very credible. There are probably a lot on there that are just a bunch of, horse pocky, but that doesn't matter. So again, this isn't about Lauren Coleman. This is about the fact that it's solidified with what he saw.
Right.
50 miles or less than 50 miles away from where he sees these footprints. 50 miles is not that far. It's really not that, especially in a wilderness situation. It's not that far away. And of course, the closest home next to the farm where he was staying in his grandparents' place over the summer was a mile and a half down the road. You're not going to just, run next door to your neighbors and say, hey, did you? No, because this is an expanse part of northern central Wisconsin. And I've been up there many times. Yeah, you got to drive a long way down the country road to get to the next house. So it's such a remote area. And at that time, he did document a lot as he grew up through the years into his 20s, 30s, and 40s, because now this is part of who he's become after he's seen this stuff and is taking interest in it and going to the library and researching. And then the internet comes about and he's getting more information and he's documenting. He's looking at that region where he was out there as an 8-year-old kid with a .22 long rifle going, yeah, it was very possible anything undiscovered could have traveled and traversed through those lands for hundreds of miles without being detected.
Yeah, and he's not wrong. I mean, we talked about this morning, Bake and I, when we're out and about the private lands and how much underdeveloped land there really is out there. Mm-hmm. And how easy it is for something to take up residence and reside in these places that are well off the grid, off in the middle of nowhere, that, may be for sale, but people don't go out there, but for, shits and giggles. And, we talk about the frequency of these Bigfoot sightings and often compared to a needle in a haystack with the needle that's always moving.
Exactly. Right.
And, a chance, you'll probably have a greater chance of being struck by lightning than you do of seeing a Bigfoot, right? I mean, that's just probably a real statistic, but I mean, it's happening more often than not now. Urban sprawl and, things that, are really affecting the now that we didn't have to worry about in the 50s and 60s, really creating a different environment for these beings to live in.
Right.
So, Ron's, going back to when he's a kid, 8 years old, he has no perspective on what he's encountering. Then he has that sighting how many years later? With the Jeep?
Oh, easily. We're talking 50 some years later. Right.
Yeah.
And that
about
farm's
that, Vance.
probably now
years.
developed and
in the interim, he's had several years to kind of make up his own thoughts and do some research, but nothing really concrete to experience or relate And now all of a
Mhm.
sudden he has that chance encounter of something that he experienced as, just think about that mental image. If you could paint that picture of being a kid, I can see it like a video, a movie flashback. Man, he's sitting in his Jeep fueling up and he looks over and sees, and then in his mind, he just has that thought in his head of him
Mhm.
seeing those footprints as a kid. Like, could you imagine that cascade of emotion that would hit
Oh,
you?
and I'm glad you brought that up because he did give me that testimony in his response that what were the chances that he did state to me, I want to make this perfectly clear. He did state to me that he didn't want his experience as a kid to influence what he saw in Estes Park. He's trying to separate those two desperately so that he's not, oh, well, that's definitely a Bigfoot because I saw footprints as a kid. He said he deliberately separated those two in his head because, and the parting words that Ron said to me was, he wants an answer before he dies. He's like, please, whatever happens before my death, I want an answer. I'm like, well, Ron, I can attest to a lot of us in this community. We're requesting the same thing. But I understand he just wants some validity personally because he's not sharing this with the world. He's sharing this with himself.
Mhm.
And I get that. He wants to know what he saw as a kid and what he saw as an adult. Can he get some validity before he dies? Is this real or not?
Well, pass along our thanks when you see Ron again for sharing his story with us. And again, Vance, we're wrapping up to the top of the hour here, so I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole. Baker, any final questions or comments you have for Vance regarding Ron Anonymous's story?
Not really. I just hope that we get a hold of him physically, that maybe we can either get him to ask additional questions or that we can get a point where he can add to the story so that we can, kind of.
I just don't want to say that we use the term story as in fictional. Like, that's
no,
not
I just
the
meant
point.
I see the story as news, not as fiction.
Yeah. I'm just clarifying for the listeners that this isn't a made-up, fabricated thing. Ron Anonymous is a real person who just prefers for his own reason to be anonymous. And we were very fortunate that he was willing to share this with Vance. So again, Vance, pass along our thank you.
I will.
To Ron for this. And perhaps if we have any questions, folks, if you want to send any questions into us through our website or SasquatchExperience.com, same as with reporting your sighting and encounter, info@SasquatchExperience.com, or hit us up on our social media, Sasquatch Experience on Facebook, Instagram, Squatch EXP on Twitter. Any of those places, if you have a question for Ron that we might be able to get to him, and perhaps Vance, we can compile them, and you can kind of do a question with them and get the answers back to us as we do a follow-up on Ron Anonymous. Something to think about.
And I'd be happy to. No, I'd be happy to do that. Like I said, towards the top of the show, he understands how this community can be. There's so many different groups in this community. He understood that a lot of groups are closely knit and very supportive of each other. And he knows there's other groups that are just vicious and want to tear each other apart. He just did not want to subject himself to being torn apart for something that he experienced as a kid. And I completely understand that. So he kind of stepped back, and this is his personal experience. Yeah. We've all had a personal experience, not cryptozoologically related, that we're not going to share with the world because you might get torn apart. Oh, no, you didn't have. Yeah, I kind of did. I had that nightmare as a child. No, you didn't.
Vance, we've talked about that many times in the show, right? That it's a very personal experience with your own sort of emotions. And, again, I use the word trauma, but your own traumas and trepidations built into sharing it. We're just glad he did. Folks, you've been listening to Sasquatch Experience. I'm Sean the Fork Chop Forker. You can find me everywhere on social media with my name at Sean Forker. Vance, where can folks find you?
Oh, they can find me on Instagram it's something. Just look up Vance on Instagram. You'll find me. I'm on Facebook too, again. So yeah, Vance Nesbitt on Facebook, and if I put something up there, it'll be interesting, and you can find me there.
He was on Grindr until he found out.
Yes, I was. Sure. Yeah, and Tinder. Yeah. No.
You can find footlongs on Grindr, Vance, but they're not the sandwiches you were looking for. And James, where can folks find you?
Right now I'm pretty much wherever Sean is in some of these things, but I'm also working on little projects. We talk about a lot about land and things like that. So I've been working on my thing. It's called Lot 56. Check it out. See what your opinion is. And,
we should change it to Stories of the Blue Man.
No.
We should change the page. Stories of the Blue Man. You're the Blue Man. Today's experience was a little sizzle, and it was a good time. Folks, again, check out our Patreon for as little as $2 a month, patreon.com/Sasquatch Experience. Starting this week or next week, you'll be able to hear Sean and Baker take on Reddit. And next week, of course, we're off, but the following week we'll be back. I'll be doing an interview with Matt Knapp over at Bigfoot Crossroads. I'm going to do a little collaborating with my old friend, Matt Knapp. So that'll be interesting. Check out that show too, folks. Bigfoot Crossroads. You can get it anywhere you can find us, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. Check it out. Matt's a good dude, and the podcast is top notch. Again, some of our compatriots, Matt Arner, Gwen Purcell, are making their way through the Bigfoot Society podcast. Check out our good friend Jeremiah over on that show. And of course, as always, check out our good friend Shannon LeGros over at Into the Fray Radio. We'll be meeting up again here soon at the beginning of June at Monster Fest. Check that out, smalltownmonsters.com/MonsterFest. I think that's the URL, and if I got it wrong, just Google the damn thing. I don't know. Folks, I'm Sean Forker. Vance has it. James Baker. If Henry May was here, he'd say, y'all be good or be good at it.
Be good at it. Keep your toes in the mud. That's it.
Yeah, that too. And of course, we'll see you in a couple weeks, folks. Good night, everybody.
You've been listening to Sasquatch Experience. Please rate and review wherever this podcast is consumed. To share your experience, visit us on Facebook or email us, squatchexperience@gmail.com. Keep on squatching.